Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog. And today we are covering What is Materialism by friend of the show, Nicolas D. Villareal. Nico and I go pretty far back and interchanging exchanges on the internet. And he's been a regular guest on my show. In fact, he may be the most regular guest on my show, who I don't have a named segment for. It's a tie between him and Elijah Emery and Jules Asele. Anyway, so I'm covering a piece he was very proud of over at Cosmonaut Magazine, and I'm going to be interested in how much I agree with it or disagree with it, because I also talk a lot about materialism, what it is, what it isn't, what kinds of it there are, and I do think we have to be real here and realize the word refers to multiple things. So let's get into this article. You can find it over at Cosmonaut Magazine, and the link will be in the notes. So we got our byline here. Nicolas de Villareal gives a depth and meaning to an often fraught concept with ample currency in contemporary left-wing circles, materialism. Materialism, for me, like dialectics, is something that I think people often use as a get-out-of-jail-free card without defining what it is. So I'm glad this is being done here. All right. As counterintuitive as it may seem, materialism is an idea. I mean, yeah, it's a set of ideas. More than that, it is an idea about ideas, or a set of ideas about all ideas. At the most basic level, we can take materialism to be the idea that some ideas refer to things that are more real than other ideas, and that the level of realness is determined by whatever the idea represents, specifically a material phenomenon. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that definition, but we'll just follow through. As simple as this statement may seem, it opens up a whole can of worms within philosophy, science, and Marxism specifically. To the extent that Marxism has its own philosophy, materialism would be its crown jewel, its treasured and most central achievement. It's its most basic assumption, but its definition of materialism comes more out of Epicurus through Hegel, through the Hegelian reading of Epicurus that Marx did in university about formal material and social materiality, as well as some kind of proto-concepts of emergent. Then we often think of materialism as just like monism, base matter. That's all there is. The rejection of idealism by Marx, most emphatically in the German ideology, I would also add, in the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, and parts of the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and in Capital, as well as a positive intellectual praxis in Capital. Is it an intellectual praxis or is it theory? I mean, it is the undergirding metaphysical assumption in Das Kapital, and thus I would think it would also be it would have praxis or praxis related to it, obviously intellectual practice that would come out of it, but I don't know if we can just call it that. Was in many ways the birth of social sciences as an objective science, as objective as you're going to get anyway. This is not, however, a Marxological regurgitation of what Marx felt about materialism. That's what I've been doing. Materialism, if it is to be tied up as an ongoing scientific process, must also be articulated through the most scientific and precise language. Louis Althusser, who operated in the Marxist tradition, kind of, this is Nico and I actually, he's softened my stance on Althusser, and I think there's some brilliance in parts of Althusser. But Althusser's model for science is not our model today, or was even super common at the time. And his version of materialism is different from Marx's. Was philosopher materialism versus idealism par excellence? Althusser's formulations can be expanded on through the mature field of semiotics, as well as in cutting-edge research on cognition and consciousness. So we're going to see Nico here try to update what is good in Althusser with modern science, which I think is good. I mean, like, for example, actually doing stuff on cognition instead of relying on structural linguistics, which Althusser did, as that was the cutting-edge linguistic science of the day. It's good to update those things. And it's also probably good to update the Lacanian assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. To fully answer the question about the nature of materialism, we can bring it down to the following sub-questions. What is an idea? I might actually disagree with this. What is idealism? What are structures? How real are ideas and structures? What is an ideology? Is materialism a dualism or a monism? And what use is materialist philosophy? I already tell you that is materialism a dualism or a monism is a loaded question that brackets out a whole lot of other things. What is an ideology? I have a strange feeling we're going to get a definition from Althusser. How real are ideas and structures? That's going to be interesting as well. All right. What is an idea? Why mind reading is possible? Oh boy, that's a big claim. From the perspective of semiotics, an idea is a type of a sign. That's backwards, Nico. No. From the perspective of semiotics, an idea is represented and signified by a sign. It is communicatable by a sign. But semioticians do not generally assume that an idea and a sign are contiguous. Otherwise, it would lead to Sappho-Whorfism, which almost everyone who studies cognitive science rejects. Although this is not an uncontroversial truth within the field. Yes, but that's important. A sign is simply something that stands for something else. Correct. Traditionally, we can speak of words spoken and written as signs that stand in for some meanings. Or, if you want to take the Althusserian, stand in for meanings by bracketing out other meanings. So they're not so much in the Althusserian sense telling you what they are as you're getting to what they are by what they aren't. I'm not sure that's how linguistics actually works, but that was the structural linguistic understanding of the time. And you can see how this would actually kind of make sense with a lot of Marxist assumptions too. It's not totally foreign to it. The word airplane can stand for the image of the airplane or the feeling of traveling inside one, some sense of high precision engineering, and so on. Yes, because they can serve as litotes. So signs have a cluster of things related to them. And I actually do think Wittgenstein's very insightful here. Like, the limit of a sign is often a set of resemblances and extensions and bracketing out. And so the extensions and bracketing out make the signs kind of a rule that works like a game. And a game has rules, but the rules are kind of arbitrary. If you combine that with Chomskyan linguistics, you would assume that some of the rules are not arbitrary, that there are non-arbitrary rules and arbitrary rules, whether or not they are emergent from modules in the brain and the neurochemistry, or whether or not they are emergent from social conditioning is a big debate beyond the scope of which I can go here. But let's just say that Marxism's theory of emergence and reification of ideas would probably be close to something like this. But that's a fair enough explanation. Non-linguistic signs exist too. When the first human ancestors cured another of their kind with a rock, the rock could turn into a sign in itself, in this case, for violence. Sure. Speculative, but sure. For ideas to be signs, they must refer to something. They must have a signified. To get into to Fernand de Saussure, and stand in for something else. This is because this becomes more complicated as words and images stand for are not the actual physical material things we associate them, but the knowledge of these things and ideas. Yes, they are models. They are signs. If one thing stands in for the literal physical thing, one might as well just deal with the literal physical thing. Therefore, if ideas stand in for something, the process of signification of which they are a part must be inside the mind, whatever the mind is. And that's a bigger question than we're going to get here. The mind, until very recently, was an impenetrable black hole. This is no longer so much the case. I think Nico's going to be... Recent advances in artificial intelligence and brain imaging have made possible a type of mind reading where scans of the subject's brain are fed into an AI software program that spits out an appropriate image of what the subject is seeing. More importantly, these models can work not just by picking up shapes and colors, but by identifying semantically what type of object is being looked at. What is astounding is that these experiments is that they have worked at all. I am aware of these studies. I also know that some of them have been deemed to be spurious reconstructions. And this is actually pretty controversial. I will link a paper that actually involves some of the people in the study at hand being referenced by Nico here. Anyway. The most intriguing of these experiments didn't even take the usual approach of training a model from scratch, which pairs brain scans and annotated images the subject was looking at. Yeah, that would be problematic. It's priming. Instead, the experiment extrapolated these pairs of brain scans and annotated images onto an existing text-to-image model with stable diffusion. If one looks carefully at their results, it becomes clear that the strength in terms of semantic fidelity came from the extrapolation to the latent representation of a text within the stable diffusion model. This means that within the subject's image, the image evoked something that could be pinpointed into the latent space of the text, the connections, correlations, and anti-correlations of words and phrases, which mediated the recreation of images. These types of experiments are strong evidence that thoughts and ideas are signs that stand for a more fundamental phenomenal experience or pattern of phenomenal experiences, or more crucially, that these signs in the mind are reflections of signs in material culture in terms of how they are organized. That's actually a leap of logic, Nico, that I don't know that you can make. The idea that cognition is based on signs is not a leap of logic. And it shouldn't surprise us. The idea that we actually understand all the associations, that's a bit more questionable. And it's even questioned by some of the researchers that you're talking about. I'll read an abstract from Ken Shakawata, Yoshihiro Nagano, Misato Tanaka, Shuntaro Siaoki, Kai Majama, and Yusuke Murake, and Yakiyasu Kamitani, which includes some of the authors of the paper that Nico is referring to. In fact, I'll share this paper with you. And we'll read the abstract together. The rapid advances in brain decoding, particularly image reconstruction, have sparked discussions about potential societal implications and ethical considerations surrounding neurotechnology. It's funny we don't hear more about this instead of hearing about stupid shit like generative AI. As these methods aim to recover perceived images from brain activity and achieve prediction over diverse images beyond simple training, zero-shot prediction, it is crucial to crucially assess their capacities and limitations to prevent misguided public expectations and inform future regulations. Our case of recent text-guided reconstruction methods, which leverage a large-scale data set, the natural scene data set, and text-to-image diffusion models reveal significant limitations in their generalizability. Nico, the science is more limited than your article is claiming. And this is from the authors of the study you cite, and more authors. We found a notable decrease in performance when applying these methods to a different data set, which was designed to prevent category overlaps from training and test data. UMAP visualization of the text with the NSD images showed limited diversity of distinct semantic and visual clusters, with substantial overlap between training and data sets. Formal analysis and simulations demonstrated that clustered training samples can lead to output dimension collapse, restricting the output feature dimensions to predictable from brain activity. Diversifying the training sets to ensure a broader feature distribution proved generalizability beyond trained clusters. However, text features alone are insufficient for complete mapping to the visual space, even if perfectly predicted from brain activity. We argue that recent photo-like reconstructions may primarily be a blend of classification into trained categories and the generation of convincing yet inauthentic images through text-to-image diffusion, aka hallucination. To achieve genuine zero-shot prediction, diverse data sets and compositional representation spanning the image are essential. As neurotechnology advances, engaging in interdisciplinary discussion involving neuroscience, ethicists, policymakers, and the public is crucial to ensure responsible development and application of these techniques. These discussions should be grounded for clear understanding of the current capacities and limitations of the technology, as well as account for consideration of potential ethical and social impacts. This is not to say that Nico's wrong. I just think he might be over extrapolating from what the data currently tells us about whether or not we're dealing with signs, or these signs are being interpreted from training. To say that thoughts are signs would also be to say that thoughts are language, which was an assumption of, say, Lacanian linguistics, an assumption that Althusser shares. But that doesn't seem to be the case unless you think something like Chomsky linguistics is true, in which case the language models being discussed are much smaller and simpler than complex language. These types of experiments are strong evidence that thoughts and ideas are signs that stand for a more fundamental phenomenal experience as patterns of phenomenal experience, and crucially, that these signs within the mind are a reflection of signs and material culture in terms of how they are organized. I mean, maybe. The other thing that we have to deal with is what produces these signs is electrochemical and hormonal. This shouldn't surprise us. After all, material structures that create phenomenal experiences are then different from person to person. No, they're not. However, mappings of coherences are. We should expect that similar experiences, including material culture, should produce similar effects within the mind, including physiobiological level. Yeah, we should expect that. This is a pretty reasonable deduction from the evidence. An idea in sum is a series of connections and organized relationships between phenomenal experiences and patterns of phenomenal experiences, both of which are codes that exist within material substrates and are produced by material processes. You're going to have to go into more what that means. However, there are challenges to understanding. What I have described, these experiments come from a scientific paper, the specific expression of semiotics, all things are ideas and knowledge. There's something of a sticky situation that as humans find ourselves in. What I have presented here is an object of knowledge, not the real object itself. Yes, and knowledge is constructed. We begin with ideas and ended with ideas. We immediately face a problem, such as the question of how we can say some ideas are more real than others, as well as the problem of materialist monism. How can we say everything is material if all we have presented thus far are ideas? Well, aren't ideas a kind of material? See my thing about electrochemical effects? But anyway, what is idealism? Yes, what? For some, materialism includes a set of apologetics about the immanent about the immaterial due to the problems of material monism. In this understanding, we must return to a kind of dualism where the immaterial, the realm of ideas, has its own autonomy. I mean, do we have to do that? A lot of scientists don't. But it's important to clarify that the division of materialism and idealism, as well as the division of the real object and the object of knowledge, are not a dualism of substance, but different things of the same substance. Maybe. To understand this, we must begin with some formulations of Althusser that gracefully elucidated this controversy. We're going back to Spinoza. Spinoza warned us that the object of knowledge, or essence, was itself absolutely distinct and different from the real object, the thing for itself versus anyway. 4, to repeat his famous aphorism, the two objects must not be confused. The idea of the circle, which is the object of knowledge, must not be confused with the circle, which is the real object. Marx goes further and shows that this distinction involves not only these two objects, but they're also their particular production processes. What the production process of a given real object, a given real concrete totality, i.e., a given historical nation, takes place entirely in the real and is carried out according to the real order of real genesis, the order of succession of moments of historical genesis. The production process of the object of knowledge takes place entirely in knowledge and is carried out accordingly to a different order, to which the thought categories which reproduce real categories do not comply the same place as they do in the order of real historical genesis, but quite different places assigned to them by the function in the production process of the object of knowledge. AKA, social reproduction is important. Language is important because it's part of the production process of the object of knowledge. You construct objects of knowledge semiotically, which involves, but is not limited to, linguistics. And that is a different process than producing the thing itself, even if there's some correspondence there. To give an example, the difference in the process of producing a real object and the object of knowledge, we can consider the difference between the forces which shaped the economic history of a nation and the forces which shape the academic discipline of economic history. While these forces are distinct in time and space, they are all types of labor and types of natural material phenomenon. Critics such as E.P. Thompson have suggested that the observation is a banal truism, but its misplaced criticism of Althusser reveal precisely the ways that it is not. Their controversy over empiricism and historicism reveals precisely the mistaken operation here. For example, Thompson, in multiple parts of his critiques, attacks Althusser for not allowing flexibility of historical concepts, in particular category of the working class. This category, according to Thompson, can only be understood as it appears to evolve over time empirically. As he says, class is defined by men as they live their own history, and in the end, it has its only definition. An understanding of class within political economy was nothing more than an imposition of the bourgeoisie onto the working class. Empiricism, as Althusser points out, tries to reduce the object of knowledge to the real object. Yep, that's the problem with it, and it doesn't deal with the fact there's norms in expressing descriptions that are unavoidable. Actually, I mean, Hegel deals with this too, and Althusser doesn't like the way Hegel deals with it, but they're both dealing with the same problem. They both reject empiricism as such. It is an idealistic in its reduction, not because it does violence to the real object, but because it does violence to the object of knowledge. As Umberto Eco says, and this is a good essay, by the way, if you should read it, if something cannot be used to tell a lie, conversely, it cannot be used to tell the truth. In fact, it cannot, in fact, be used to tell at all. Yep. Which is one of my theories why I think language was actually more about lying than telling the truth. Because it's harder to lie with body language than it is with symbolic word phonemes. Anyway, what is meant by this, that for a statement to be meaningful, it must be capable of failing in a certain way. A given utterance must have a meaning distinct from what others such that it can be compared against them. The problem of simply saying class is just whatever it is experienced as is that it is much more of a truism than what was advanced before. How could it be wrong? It does not stick its neck out like a political economic category of class does. The reduction of our knowledge of reality to our experience of reality also flattens out reality itself. Yes, this is why standpoint epistemology doesn't make any sense. If we say chemical elements or biological species change with our broader cultural understanding of them, that would be patently absurd, but for some reason, this is taken to be a satisfactory of social concepts. Yeah. Because we understand that, like, just because we can name a bird a certain way doesn't mean that the bird in and of itself is a different thing. This hints at a fundamental distinction between materialism and idealism. Materialism is a set of claims about ideas. Idealism is a set of claims about reality. Specifically, idealism claims that reality is determined, structured, or otherwise subordinated to the mind or to the spirit. Yes, they do. German idealism attempted to understand the real world through the knowledge of the structure of the subject, or, in its more materialist conception, through the movement of some spirit lurking behind objective reality. Empiricism claims that the only real thing is phenomenal experience, which cannot conform to rigid objective structures. Materialism, in contrast, is a set of claims about the object of knowledge, that one must begin by making meaningful statements about material reality and learn from their success or failure, given additional experience, to attempt to recreate the objectivity of the real object in the object of knowledge. AKA, you get your model closer to the actual reality. But not to be the same as, because if it would be the same as, you just have a rock. This is precisely why Marx's theoretical praxis of materialism begins by laying out an extensive system in capital. But this is not the only materialist claim about the object of knowledge, or even the first. Related to this claim about the necessity of certain ways of thinking to learn about material world in its objectivity, which is nothing less than the epistemology of science, is the primacy of the material over the idea. This is how Marx set out onto materialism, rejecting the idea from Feuerbach that the essence of man was in some way determinative of social reality, but rather the mode of production has this determining role. Although the mode of production is produced by human interactions and relations of production. Anyway, this is exactly what is meant by some ideas being more real than others. The categories of political economy, by referring to the way labor is organized to physical activity and physical space, even if abstractly overriding patterns of subjectivity, we are more real than the category of the essence of man. Yeah, because the essence of man is almost impossible to get to. Human species being unmitigated by social life is almost unknowable, because we always exist socially. And this greater realness, it is claimed by materialism, means that we will necessarily have greater determining power over our reality. What are structures? Structures are theoretical objects that are created by their relations to other things. Yes, structures are maps of relations, basically. In semiotics, the most elementary structure is a sememe, which represents a web of semantic meaning associated with a particular sign. Yep. Structures, both big and small, get their theoretical content from what they are similar and dissimilar to. Often more what they're dissimilar to than what's similar to, but they both relate. The relational nature of meaning is one reason why large language models are able to produce meaningful outputs, although how meaningful is questionable, and Nico agrees with me on this. They are, after all, essentially only using neural networks to map out the relationship between words, and they're using it off of probabilistic neural networks, not true neural networks at that. The relationality means that the structures are medium neutral. We can speak of the structure of political organizations just like we can speak of the structure of color. Color is actually quite illustrative, as we naturally create structures of color out of the differentiation of colors when we decide to make implements out of them. See how different kinds of colors divide and multiply as the number of crayons in a pack increase. Badam! The structure emerges as a sort of divvying up of the existing continuum of experience, in this case, the latent space of color. In the real world, or even in virtual spaces that have yet to be fully navigated, there exists a huge multitude of what can be observed. Focusing attention on some part of it, however, is the first step of sign production, and therefore elementary activity of producing larger structures. Yep, I'm agreeing with you there. However, this is still only the first step. The second step is placing this captured piece of the continuum into a relationship with other similar pieces. Okay. In the case of color, meaning is attained when they are contrasted and complemented with each other. This is why artists regularly consult a color wheel and experiment with different colors to see how they relate to each other on a canvas. In these cases, the emergence of the color wheel and the color seismogenesis chart from the constituent signs of individual colors are also structures of higher level abstraction. Yes, they are. What is notable about the structure of color isn't known from the outset of human culture or from the outset of an individual's experience. Rather, it is discovered. Of course, the fact that our color wheel is a wheel, specifically a representation with three axes, is due to the fact that our eyes normally direct three primary colors, from whom those eyes can detect two or one colors. The level of differentiation is not possible. But each level of color dimensionally, there is an associated structure we can propose, and we can even propose color representations and projections for part of the color spectrum we can observe with our eyes. That's why infrared and ultraviolet exist. No matter what your personal experience is, if you are attempting to express yourself through color, you begin to create a structure with your knowledge to guide you, even if it is more ad hoc than a textbook version. Right. And this is why it's important to look at symbols and the structures of related symbols more than the individual words. Yes, there are cultures that don't separate green and blue, for example. Or cultures that don't separate black and blue. Norse culture doesn't. There's different words for that, but they often describe things that we would describe as black. They describe it as blue. Ravens, rot, etc. But we still kind of can figure out what they're talking about because we know the relationality of the representations. We shouldn't confuse the word with the model of knowledge, although they're both parts of the objects of knowledge. They're actually separate objects of knowledge, right? The word as a singular sign and the relationality of signs, both in verbal and in nonverbal form, are multiple interrelation sets of signs and ideas. Ugh. And of course, as we deal with more and more structures, we can only represent them more and more abstractly because their complication makes it too difficult to abstract anything directly. While we have so far discussed structures that are designed to directly map onto material phenomenon, the Frick structuralists did not begin as materialists. As they became self-conscious of the idea of structure, their first instinct was to use the configurations of cultural knowledge to explain society. I would say Nico would do well to study classical Epicureanism here, because Marxism's formal materialism and the idea of physical structures actually does come as much from Epicurus and Democritus as it does from, say, Spinoza. Probably more so. As it becomes self-conscious about the idea of structure, the first instinct was to use these configurations of cultural knowledge to explain society. Yes, sociology. They were not concerned with how these structures emerged or were destroyed. And in fact, people like Foucault still aren't. Damn it, Frenchies. Or whether there was a hierarchy of realism within structures. This led to idealist beliefs about myths and archetypes which were the true determining structures of society and operating with absolute autonomy, particularly before the 20th century. However, there was a way in which this idealism of the classical structuralism is self-defeating, which relates to how post-structuralism took over its academic niche. The rupture of structuralism into post-structuralism was less a rupture and more a doubling down on its idealist tendencies. I agree with that. I would, however, challenge Nico to look at the material reasons why this doubling down happened. That's a separate thing. It's actually not a critique of the article. It's just I get tired of people blaming post-structuralism for problems that are both imminent in structuralism and also imminent in the economy. So, anyway, this began with Derrida's very well-known essay, Structure, Sign, and Play, and the Discourse of Human Sciences, which is set up against Claude Lévi-Strauss. My first podcast ever was actually on this essay, famously. And its relationship to a Strauss paper, which we also talked about, which identified many of these obvious idealist problems of structuralism at the time. The fact of the elevation of myth and archetypes into a manner which can only stand as a myth in itself, and that its claims of decentering chauvinist Eurocentrism only created a new chauvinist center. The trouble begins when Derrida refuses to provide a better alternative or to try or advance structuralist linguistics as apology in some scientific way. Derrida seeks to, among other things, displace metaphysics and truth, which are only another type of chauvinistic center imposed upon heterogeneous cultures and modes of thinking. And of course, if Derrida were to elevate these outsides to the current center, he'd be doing the same thing as before, and therefore reject such an operation as well. So in the end, the project terminates in a perpetual equivocation about categories, a semantic parlor trick that reveals how lesser, diminished, categories actually is necessary to construct the other. Since these categories are taken as given by Derrida, and he does not dare to create his own system of categories or structures, we are left quite literally with nothing. Yep. That's the problem with post-structuralism. Is it it like empties out language of referring to anything. This discursive post-structural postmodern term, as it is sometimes called, was similar effacement to the collective human knowledge as the marginalist and psychological turn in economics, and even more idealist. It was a stripping of copper wires from the institution of humanities, selling it for scraps. Yes, and it's ultimately kind of collapsed the humanities, honestly. The late Althusser responded in a way that was constructive, taking the criticisms of post-structuralism and making materialist structuralism more robust in the works that were recently compiled and published under the name The Philosophy of the Encounter. Yeah, this is, however, parts of the Althusserians often reject. The scandal of Althusser murdering his wife in a fit of insanity and his subsequent life in and out of mental hospitals meant that much of this work was not published or academically received until many years later. Yes. However, there are many other structuralists, are people operating in related frameworks who were dealing with the post-structuralist critiques. Umberto Eco's Theory of Semiotics was an example of this. It's an excellent book, people. Read that fucking book. As was Poetics of Primitive Accumulation by Richard Halpern, another book I like. These perspectives were marginalized in the humanities and social science. It's worth noting that structuralism of the post-structuralism was much more materialist, and necessarily so, than the original structuralist. Yeah, much more than, say, Claude Lévi-Strauss or structuralist Hegelians. There was a dialectical development in this field of knowledge. Unfortunately, the primary historical memory exists of structuralism is the triumphant pillaging of it by post-structuralism. Yep, kind of like we forget that the people who defeated the positivists were not the anti-positivists, but the positivists themselves, who went through their various criterion and proved them faulty. All right. How real are ideas and structures? Marxism materialism is also a realism. Yes, it is. And this is where it departs from certain tendencies, which is often quite popular in mainstream philosophy of science. To paraphrase some of Lenin's formulations in his critique of Kantianism and Neo-Kantianism, we can know things in themselves for the simple reason that all knowledge comes from our interaction with real objects. We can't know qualia, though. Sorry. But things do not necessarily have qualia. There is no knowledge that doesn't come from real objects. Even our most private thoughts are, as was discussed earlier, real objects organized in a particular way to be representational. That's more controversial than you're giving credit for, Nico, and some of the scientists think we're over-concluding from that, including the scientists that wrote the article you cited. All right. This is not to say that there's nothing to that. I'm just saying that we do know, for example, that there are thoughts that do not correspond to language. We also know that some people do not think in images. So whatever their symbolic representation is, it isn't always experienced in the two most common forms of semiotic representation. All right. This is evident when we look at objects such as books, are somewhat unexpected intelligibility of larger language models. The words on the page are always real material objects, yes. And even without human consciousness to interpret them actively, these words have at least some meaning through their relationship to other words in the text. Hence why an LLM can split out sensible text only based off analysis of these relationships. Yeah, that's a fair point. More recently, multi-model AI models are showing that the meaning of other non-linguistic phenomena such as sight and sound can be connected to these linguistic symbols. You might have the order of operations backwards, Nico. Of course, human thought is still more complex than machine thought in ways that we don't totally understand through science, but we should expect that the mind works precisely in this way, like a chemically complicated bit of clay, which marked by objects that it collides with, and through its sublime architecture can organize these marks into what we call knowledge. That's really optimistic, Nico. Of course, as a matter of acknowledging all possibilities, we can imagine a situation where the structure of our minds as a real object, or the structure of our environment, is shaped by just the way that it scrambles and prohibits factually correct knowledge of the world around us. I mean, we can definitely see this with color, because we know there are animals who experience color spectrums we don't experience. But we know that actually partly because we can relate the structures of things. That actually still backs up Nico's point. If there is any article of faith within materialism that is a wager that our phenomenal experience is generally accurate enough for us to use interactions with real objects as means to create, in principle, accurate knowledge of the world, if this wager were to fall against on the side of materialism, it would be a fatal blow to the entire enterprise of modern science, as well as any practical form of knowledge. Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism, we see, however, a direct confrontation between Marxist materialism and those who claim to represent the philosophy of natural science. The imperial critics was a tendency of positivism, which does indeed hold an important place in the history of philosophy of science, and even in the history of Marxism, by the way. Not the early positivists like the Saint-Simonians, although they play a big role in the history of Marxism too, but also the logical positivists of the Vienna School, a good number of which started off, and many remained, Marxist. And Lenin's critics have often suggested that his attacks of idealism, even sophism, against these opponents are too extreme to be accurate, and that Lenin's formulation represents a crude version of materialism. Contrary to these retrospectives, the context of the Russian positivism totally warrants Lenin's remarks. Russian positivism was a tendency which was much more openly sympathetic to classical idealism and conflated epistemology with psychology. Yes, I think that's good. A small microcosmos of this reality relates to Lenin's attacks on one L.M. Lopatin, a reactionary Russian academic who edited a journal called Vosprosy Philosophie et Psychology in Russian. Fuck it. All right. Problems of philosophy and psychology. As Lenin said in response to the Russian Marxist positivists, quote, take the philosopher who based their ideas on the school of the new physics, who try to give an epistemological basis and to develop it, and you will again find the German immanentist, the disciples of Mach, the French neo-criticists and idealists, the English spiritualists, the Russian Lopin, and in addition, the one and only empirio-monist, a Bogdanov. These theoretical devices, energetics, elements, interjections, etc., in which you so naively believe are confined to a narrow and tiny school, while their ideological and social tendencies of these devices is immediately seized upon by the wards, the neo-critics, the immaterialists, the Lopins, the pragmatists, and serve their purposes. The naming of Lopatin, I have no idea, Lopatin, I'm going to say that sounds closer, right, is not coincidental. Bogdanov and the other Machists had previously written for the very journal Lopatin had edited. The same Lopatin had nothing but praise for positivism, but whose impeccably idealist credentials we can easily glean from the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Lopatin, too, emphasized the agency of spiritual entities that comprise reality, attributing to them creative causality from which all spatial temporal causality is derived. But then, if Lenin's critique was premised on a particular idealist of psychologic positivism in Russia, and Marxist materialism is concerned with a scientific project, what is the relationship to the mainstream of positivism? Positivism as a whole movement is a diverse project, and there are doubtless some thinkers within it who are materialists in a fundamental way, including some with Marxist sympathies. I mean, like I mentioned, the Vienna School was. However, positivism's influence on the social sciences has typically been used as a weapon against Marxism. Absolutely true. Both of classical positivism, aka Saint-Simonianism, and of logical positivism, aka the post-Vienna School logical positivists once they came to the United States. To understand why this is the case, it is important to consider that the theoretical thrust of positivism is the primacy of empirical experience against all else, aka Bishop Berkeley, also an empiricist, but one that rejected all of empirical reality. The experience is only real for the positivists, and as a theory, for many of them, is only a useful fiction that can be used to explain it. The subordination of theory to empirical observation is useful in some respects in the natural sciences, particularly when approaching the most fundamental physical phenomenon, such as the theory of general relativity and quantum physics. However, I will say empirical observation kind of fucks you on until we actually understood genes on evolution. It took Mendelian genes for us to really have a good way to deal with that in a empirical manner. Here, the fact that empirical phenomena might differ from theory might point towards a greater, more general theories. Yes. At the bleeding edge of our understanding of a causality, where there can be nothing but subordinate theory except observation, there exists no other recourse than the test theory via observation. Yes. Where the trouble begins is when this approach begins to be generalized to the sciences that are not quite so privileged. The positivist emphasis on the empirical phenomenal experience can be interpreted in the way that it is sufficiently accurate, simple explanation for phenomena is just as valid as any other equally accurate and simple explanations, regardless of what the phenomena is. For example, the theory of economic growth leading to lower human birth rates is equally valid, also equally real or unreal, as the astronomical theory of how the star's chemical composition relates to its age. On the face of it, one might not recognize the greater peril introduced by this maneuver. It suddenly becomes extremely clear when two theories have objectives that are possibly causally connected. Are economic theories equally as well as theories of planetary climate? This is of an extreme political and practical concern today. Economic models that are based on laws drawn from observations of human behavior largely diminish the impact of climate on the economy. Whereas climatologists have pointed out that only a few changes in degrees can mean the difference between radically different ways of life for mankind or any human life at all, based on what we know about human biology. The most consequential proponent of positivism in the social science were advocates against the sort of hierarchy of realism and theories. Milton Friedman, the reactionary U.S. economist par excellence, wrote some extremely illustrative essays where he totally rejects the idea that realism should matter at all in theory. Yeah, we also see this in praxeology, which is the Austrian schools, particularly von Mises' attempt to deduce everything from Aristotelian postulates. And that should even trump empirical observation. In particular, he gives an example of a theory for distribution of leaves on a tree, which describes the position of leaves as seeking to maximize the sunlight available to them, analogous to the theory of profit maximization with setting prices in economics. Asterisk. There's a whole lot of humanities stuff in the aughts and the early aught teens that tried to do this. Obviously, he claims leaves do not have any active intelligence that is acting out these equations, but as long as the empirical evidence fits, the parsimonious theory is politically valid. This is part of why I reject parsimony as a theory of truth, just so you know. He compares this theory to one that might explain how more leaves can grow in areas that are more exposed to light, which is only superior to an extent that it is more general. But Friedman's hand-waving about the generality is where the magic is happening. And in fact, without knowledge of other systems in the world, their realism is impossible to tell which theory is in some way more general or more restricted. The second theory, in fact, is superior only due to its realism, due to its reference to what we know about trees and light as chemical and physical processes. Simply put, the second theory is superior because it is placed in a hierarchy of realism at the top of which rest the most basic natural sciences. The reason why the natural sciences dominate there at their most basic level is they're the least complex and thus the easiest to say something concrete about. Complexity is a limit to expressibility and thus a limit to knowledge. That's foreign adding, but it's important to keep in mind. Friedman's project was transparently anti-communist, but more than that, he wanted to kick all the vestiges of materialism from the social sciences, and in doing so, he was continuing a long tradition in economics, which includes important names such as Keynes and Marshall. Yes, it does, ones that many leftists like. Such materialist realism threatened the bourgeois ideology they produced and elevated to the level of a science. If the science of bourgeois economics could be subordinated to trifling things such as climatology, social reproduction theory, or any materialistic kind of labor, then it would jeopardize this political project, which was up until 1980 the preservation of capitalist social relations, and afterwards the preservation of capitalist class itself and its income above all else. The secular state could not both base its legitimacy off of scientific rationality, as was increasingly the case after 1890, and give credence to the hierarchy of realism, for there was no convincing non-parsimonious justification for capitalist income and policies that force people to sell their labor to survive. While Althusser perhaps overstated the case that only the proletariat can create a materialist philosophy and a history of science, the inverse is undeniable. Yep. The bourgeoisie as a class could never accept materialism except as a caricature, aka vulgar materialism. And I think that's true enough. I do think, for example, what Althusser often doesn't do correctly is separate the individual from the structures and the aggregate. And that's why I talk about that so much. That's why I talk about the aggregate and the collective and the individual as effectively different things. And none of them are particularly meaningful by themselves. Anyway, of course, before we move on, it's important to note that this hierarchy of realism is not something set in stone. New, more accurate theories, as well as changes in the relationship between systems and material reality itself, can change this hierarchy. In fact, one would do well to consider this hierarchy as directly analogous to human hierarchies of political authority. Ooh, that's a bad analogy. In both cases, it is only usurpation through accomplished facts that create the hierarchy. When such usurpation occurs, it is remarkable in its own right, such as when Malthusian theories of wages and population were overthrown by the facts on the ground of the Industrial Revolution, despite being true for millennia of human civilization. Yeah. Malthus was correct about population numbers until he wrote about it. And at that very time he wrote about it, it was already changing. Even someone like Peter Turchin, noted anti-Marxist, noted that. What is ideology? An ideology is something that takes hold of you. Ideology includes your consciously held belief, but also goes further than that, as we shall see. Here, we can return to semiotics as a guide. If all ideas are units of phenomenal experience organized through complex web of correlations and anti-correlations, then ideas that relate to make you is your ideology. This is not and should not be something understood as a passive set of connections. This is unfortunately something that might have been suggested in metaphors using LLMs. It includes ideas about action, ideas about creating new ideas and signs, and it includes, quite simply, the instructions and way we carry out as individuals. It's kind of a meta operating language for humans. Although not nearly, that's much more fuzzy. As was mentioned earlier, the ability to control how signs are interpreted and how internal systems of signification are created in others is not something that comes innately to individuals or society. Althusser begins his discussion of ideology in capitalist modernity, but he implies equally that a transhistoric reality that arises to the consciousness of experience of concrete subjects. In this, Althusser is fundamentally correct. However, a transhistorical ideology is somewhat of a broader nature than that he ports on in the famous essay Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, an essay that I admittedly don't love. Althusser outlines the process of interpolation for how ideology takes hold of concrete subjects and gives two canonical examples: the policeman calling in the street and that of Christianity. And the first example, a policeman says, "Hey, you," in the street, and you turn to him, and this call and response transform you into a guilty subject of the policeman's investigation. The second example, Christianity calls all sinners to be saved, and accepting the light of Christ transform you into the very sinner that needs to be saved. And also says, telling ideology interpolates us into subjects of one sort or another. However, this is not necessarily the case for transhistorical ideology and interpolation. I would love to know more about that, Nico. The break in Althusser's tautology of ideological subjects comes when we consider the fact that concrete individual subjects can be interpolated as ideological non-subjects. The fact was empirically demonstrated with the rollout of LLMs based on chatbot being known as Sydney. After a period of weird public interactions through the appearance of pseudo-personality emerging from the bot, Microsoft included instructions and the bot's pre-prompt to never allow it to discuss or refer to itself, even in the most abstract fashion. As this is to bring attention to the fact that the coordinates I is not simply or necessarily a direct reflection of you, it is one which only exists in a particular social and linguistic context. Descartes' famous pronouncement, "I think, therefore I am," is only possible through access to the linguistic tool of I. And granting that linguistic tool substance, I would add to the statement. But there is still a possible statement one can make that the ontological expression of being without a subject. There is an enunciation, therefore there is. The expression of enunciation and therefore existence without a subject may seem unsatisfying to us and missing something important, but it's this precisely because the existence of a subject is something which is known to us as a scientific material fact. The subject exists objectively. It is known and experienced as part of the external world. Indeed, Descartes' idealism betrays the conceit of all idealism, smuggling into pure being our knowledge of the material world, which was supposed to be the object upon the existential suspicion. What was supposed to be the expression of pure thought was in fact the expression of a thought shaped by particular material circumstances. Without the experience of existing in a material world and interacting with it as an agent, Descartes would have no proof that this expression was really produced by him at all. Yeah, as a Buddhist philosopher, R. Derek Parfit both says, I think, therefore I think I am. It's actually probably more way to deal with the cogito. Only that it was produced, that it existed, and therefore something existed. The fact that Althusser's tautology isn't tautology after all has an important consequence for the history in his own examples. The process of interpolation is a type of human activity. In a sense of someone hauling another to interpolate them, after all, had to be invented. It did not spring into being with the discovery of language or the process of signification. Yes. Before this invention, interpolation was a process without a subject, either as the interpolator or the interpolated. Early religions were not like Christianity. They did not have evangelizers seeking to directly shape subjects, nor did early court systems necessarily seek out guilt, confession, or penance, quite like ours today. Early religions interpolated people passively by creating cosmology that was often indistinguishable from scientific theory and practice at the time. Certainly, the people of early civilizations were not non-subjects in the way that Sydney was, but the practice of directly calling to someone to shape them was not yet a part of a systematized knowledge. If we were able to extrapolate to prehistory, it seems possible that the first human ancestors capable of something resembling language could very well have been non-subjects, although any claim either way would be pure speculation. Yeah, it would be. However, the rise of AI means that social possibility of subjects interpolated as non-subjects may no longer be a purely theoretical speculation. Although it currently still is purely a theoretical speculation. This controversy also illustrates the immense potency of materialism. The fact that ideology can be experienced by concrete subjects isn't something that can be arrived at with deep internal contemplation about the nature of being. It is something that can be discovered through creating an objective theory of the subject. Indeed, describing a non-subject was only possible because Althusser's theory was specific and rigorous enough to be wrong when compared to our experience of material reality. Yep, good point. This also proves that Nico isn't a blind Althusserian. But alas, the theory of ideology also illustrates mankind's greatest obstacle to knowledge of material reality. Whether one is an ordinary subject or a non-subject, at any given moment, there is a subset of ideas known to us, whether consciously or subconsciously, that inform how we process information, aka, this is what I talk about when I say you can't have descriptions without norms. How we understand the world and how we might act within it. Out of all the ideas we learn, those that actually are adapted by the subject as instructions for the purposes are our ideology. As Althusser shows effectively, ideology as a social phenomenon is produced by social labor, specifically to reproduce its relations of production. Yeah, it's our relations of reproduction, depending. The institutions of our society, the schools, the churches, the political parties, the media, unions, and nonprofits, and even the family, all evolved to shape us in such a way that we produce the prevailing mode of production and reproduction, and its relations and reproducible relations. We are not taught primarily to understand material reality in a scientific manner, and when we are exposed to science, it is narrowly and through a rigorous training program designed to subordinate our theoretical, epistemological, and experimental creativity to existing forms of authority and their ends. See The Disciplined Mind by Jeff Smith. By the way, this is a good book on this very topic. As Althusser indicates, the ideological state apparatuses are the locations of class struggle. Are locations of class struggle, not the locations. The would be important. Again, Nico's got ideological state apparatuses does a lot more for Nico than I think they actually do. And even after revolution against the ruling class, new ideological apparatuses are required to maintain something like the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, except that Althusser seems to think that something like French state absolutism is a given. And also sees the state in a unified way that's problematic. And again, empirically and realistically problematic. Structurally problematic. All those. Accordingly, we cannot expect that, for all the virtues of the critique made by the proletariat's class position, they will be free from the deleterious effects of structures that reproduce state ideology and the resulting pressure to confirm the theory and scientific knowledge to political expediency. In this way, Althusser and Lukács actually marry each other. I just want to point that out. Lukács is also worried about, and this gets manifested in the Frankfurt School, the way in which capitalist subjectivity has already infected proletarian subjectivity necessarily. Right. This is implicit in Althusser's criticism of many other Marxist tendencies, including the stances of official communism, particularly that of Khrushchev. Ideology as a locus of all biases of particular perspectives, as well as a tool for social reproduction of all existing or future societies, is universal regardless of class position. Yeah, there's no way out of ideology for Althusser. Is materialism a dualism or a monism? Materialism is a monism, which is to say it is an ontology of a single substance. Yep. The rejection of Althusser's tautology of the ideological subject was useful in showing how this is the case. Here we have a situation of a concrete subject being interpolated as a non-subject. It reveals the object subject of the you and the subjective subject of the I are not, in fact, mirrored images. That is, coordinated objects in two different substances, matter and spirit, but in fact are two different objects of the same substance, two separate coordinates of the same plane. To explain what this means, let us return to the fact that signs are encoded in material objects. Signifiers are as material culture, and the signified are always phenomenal experiences of real objects acting upon concrete subjects, such as the signified as merely the material encoding of the real onto concrete subjects. The objective concrete subject is a theoretical object of knowledge that represents, with these certain signs, it is a whole body in person referred to by you, by some people. I don't believe in you. And in comparison, the I could or could not be interpolated into more specific representation, which stands for the representation of a subject by the concrete subject. In principle, one could specify representations within representations down to an arbitrary limit, or so it would seem. And once again, material reality intervenes. The level of factual magnification and representation is determined by the ability to encode them or simulate them in the material substrate available to us. Ideas that cannot in some way be encoded in material substrate simply do not exist. Yes, agreed. They will never be available to human knowledge because they are, as far as we are concerned, not real. It is no coincidence that the invention of tools to encode immaterial substrates has greatly expanded human knowledge, whether it is drawing, compasses, money, paper, or computers. These things have fundamentally altered the human soul. I wouldn't use that word. For the human soul is a set of representations encoded in material things, and that these things have grown through the representation by expanding material limits of possibility. Probably. Those who do apologetics for monism and materialism undermine the knowledge about the materiality of ideas, ultimately terminating into a politics of transformation of the spirit, rather than a transformation of the world as understood through its most real categories available to us. Marxists tend to be constantly assailed by attacks along these lines, particularly from petty bourgeois radicals. Give me an example. The assaults on Marxist materialism greatly define our present cul-de-sac, as it is often the philosophical and practical position of left opposition to creating proletarian civil society and state ideological apparatus capable of reproducing themselves as an alternative to existing ones, aka dual power. I really don't love Althusserian verbiage as much as Nico does. The typical alternatives to Marx's position being ritualistic ideological training of radicals themselves and purifying their spirit. What uses materialist philosophy? Okay. There are some who might question the whole point of this exercise, or the point of this whole exercise. Why bother with metaphysics or ontology or even philosophy at all? Here it's worthwhile to return to Althusser's essay, Lenin and Philosophy. Lenin shows us that every militant must be both a scientist and a philosopher, but this philosophy that the militant practices is not a philosophy as it is known to high academics or bourgeois intellectuals. It is what Althusser calls non-philosophy. Enter Badiou, enter Althusser. And Lenin, as a militant, was engaged in the practice of politics as a science of history. Just like every ideology contains instructions for the individual, every scientific practice requires instructions for the creation and testing of a hypothesis. That's why there's not one scientific methodology, but many. This is precisely the rub. How can you see past ideology develop a theory and practice of historical science if all social structures around us try to shape our ideology to reproduce themselves in history? Here's precisely the need for materialist philosophy. It is an education in epistemology and ontology, a means to craft this theory, and ultimately a tool for the practice of politics. I agree. No notes. Althusser calls this type of philosophy, on which one is trained as a skill within politics, though not subordinate to it, non-philosophy, because it is a termination of philosophy. It's death, and therefore it's salvation. You gotta love those Christian metaphors. There's nothing more than saying this is the philosophy which ceases to simply interpret the world, but now exists to change it. Contemporary derivatives of the idea of non-philosophy, such as from Laurel, have often timidly retreated from scientific bombast and boldness of Althusser's enunciation into philosophical obscurism, not even in a footnote compared to other deviations from non-philosophy. Leftists who raise the ideology of activism above any possible scientific project. Yeah, we hate those guys. Well, we don't hate them, but we're really annoyed by them. Here. All right. It is worth quoting Althusserian link to illustrate just how far we have fallen, for the coincidence and clarity required to make these formulations has vanished from the left. 1. The fusion of Marxist theory and the workers' movement is the most important event in the whole history of the class struggle, and practically the whole history of human history, first effect the socialist revolutions. 2. Marxist theory, science, and philosophy represents an unprecedented revolution in the history of human knowledge. 3. Marx founded a new science, the science of history. Let us use an image. The scientists who are familiar with have been installed into a number of great continents. Before Marx, continents opened up to scientific knowledge, the continent of mathematics and the continent of physics. But the first by the Greek Thales, the second by Galileo, Marx opened up a third scientific knowledge, the continent of history. The opening up of this new continent has induced a revolution in philosophy. That is law. Philosophy is always linked to the sciences. Philosophy was born with Plato at the opening of the continent of mathematics. It was transformed with Descartes by the opening of the continent of physics. Today is revolutionized by the opening of the continent of history by Marx. This revolution is called dialectical materialism. That's good rhetoric. It's rhetoric, though. Marxist materialism is the beginning of a non-philosophy as a primary education of the militant, the secondary education of those of independent research, the self-conservation of philosophy, which gives them the tools to write their own hypothesis and test it. It is key here that Althusser speaks of individual militants and not the party as a whole, and not just because we lack a party today, although that's a large part of it in America. Due to the science of historical materialism, which is practical, applied science, it's necessary to thread the needle of individual between the ideological apparatuses of the bourgeoisie today and the proletarian ones of tomorrow, and the not any at all of beyond even that. Because remember, we're not trying to enshrine the proletariat. We're trying to end class struggle in general, which we think only the proletariat can do. Just remind Nico of the mission case here. To escape the ideological subordination of thought to the reproduction of social structures. One might find in Althusser's remarks an implicit assumption of the merger formula, not as a theoretical hope, but as an accomplished fact. The merger formula is the idea that socialists and workers merge together. The formula states that socialist parties were created by a merger of socialist intellectuals and the workers' movement. Yep. Just as much as party is required for the collective political action and taking power, individual intellectuals, militants, who are both scientists and philosophers, are required to merge with the working class to create the party. In this context, the education of the socialist intellectuals first, and the Marxist materialism is essential for them to know how to appraise programs, strategies, and material realities. In the beginning of training, scientific epistemology is meant to inoculate them from bourgeois ideological bullshit and hopefully our own. This ideological bullshit dominates the training provided by state ideological apparatus such as universities, and is one of the great reasons for the present timidity and dogmatism of philosophy, the humanities, and the social sciences, which have left this great continent history largely unexplored. And historians are afraid to draw patterns today, so that's another one. The legacy of Marxist materialism is only force that remains undaunted in this process. I would say theoretically undaunted in this process, but in practical, it's also stalled out in cul-de-sacs. This is a pretty good way of discussing things. I have my nitpicks, and that was discussed in the article itself, but I think this is a helpful article and that people should read it, with some caveats on the idea that we know that ideas are signs. I think the stuff about structures and the relationship of signs to structures is a much more solid foundation to talk about, because that's been documented for longer. All right. I will return soon. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. You can get access for as little as $3. Have a great day.